YouTube keeps asking me, is blank killing democracy? For instance, is capitalism, some aspect of capitalism, or member of the capitalist class killing democracy? Is democracy under threat from money in politics or low voter turnout? What about misinformation, AI, or even the internet as a whole? Is Trump or the Republican Party or the Supreme Court an existential threat to democracy? You might also have heard democracy or the government or the country is broken, corrupt, divided, and lost its way. If people believe in democracy but have lost hope, then someone killed a democracy that was presumably once vibrant. But as we'll see, no one has killed democracy because there was never any democracy to kill. I'm Chris, and welcome back to the channel that auto-played after you finished watching Andrewism. Hi, I'm wearing a different colored shirt to tell you about this video's sponsor, Scent of a Bird. When you go out, you want to smell your best. The real players know women love guys who smell like birds. That's why you need Scent of a Bird. It'll have you smelling like a bird all day long. There are a few assumptions underlying the fear that we're losing our democracy. The first is there are only two ways of organizing the world: democratic state and authoritarian state. There's no other way of organizing society worth trying, or if there is, it wouldn't work for us. That's because we're taught to believe words from authority over the evidence of our own eyes. There's a secret third thing. You know how you can work and organize and make decisions with other people without threatening them with prison? That's because in the absence of force, society organizes itself. I'm not going too deep into that premise today. Click here if you want to talk about how society works. The assumption I want to spend more time on in this one is that we have a democracy. Doesn't democracy mean that the people rule rather than a small class that has all the money? If so, when has there ever been a democratic state? Democracy has led to this oppressive, unequal, imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy that the whole world lives under. Why would the people choose any of this? Democratic systems coexist quite comfortably with slavery, war, genocide, mass criminalization, homelessness, and so on, not because some huge percentage of the population wanted it, but because democracy doesn't work for the people. A few people own your so-called democracy. The people this system claims to represent are mostly just the really rich and well-connected. That's not because not enough people are getting their voices heard, marching, voting, or signing petitions. It's not because the law or the Constitution aren't being respected. It's by design. Some people will disagree with me because how could it be undemocratic? We still vote. There's more than one political party. Isn't that what democracy is? Well, if so, it doesn't sound super representative. Does the government do what you want it to? Has it ever consulted you to hear your thoughts on a policy it's considering and then taken your objections into account? Do you feel you have power over the government? Or vice versa? Either democracy is just another word for a system of ruling class domination of everyone else, or it's an unattainable ideal the ruling class dangles in front of us to keep us hoping. Or maybe both. If this system is supposed to be democratic, when was it? Back when the country had slaves? Back when it had colonies? Back when it was drafting the poor into wars for territorial expansion? Was there ever a country that didn't have a ruling class making the decisions for a disenfranchised majority? No, because there are no such countries. The democracy that existed was the system that empowered people to create the problems we have now. It is the system preferred and chosen and owned by the ruling class. It's not that anything they're doing is destroying democracy, it's that there never was any democracy. The proof is precisely what these folks are worried about, that a couple of politicians and judges owned by a couple of rich people can ruin democracy. If it's that easy to destroy a democratic state, just giving access to it to unsavory people, maybe it wasn't the bulwark against dictatorship we were taught. I think Trump and all the worst people in the US taking the White House is an obvious example. Another is the Supreme Court. SCOTUS is supposed to be part of those checks and balances you learned about in civics class. It keeps granting itself and the president greater powers, centralizing more decisions. It's less of a check and more of a lever. You might say what the court is doing is unconstitutional and they aren't supposed to take all this power, but they do. Because constitutions don't limit but empower the state. I know people who were surprised the Supreme Court approved of Donald Trump running for president despite his legal record and after he tried to orchestrate a coup. But they shouldn't be. This week, I saw people desperately appealing to the courts to bar Trump from office under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And of course, they would bar him if indeed they were compelled to abide by the Constitution. But they interpret and rule the way they want. I'm old enough to remember that in 2000, the Supreme Court handed the presidency to George W. Bush by deciding all on their own that he had won the election. Believing in checks and balances or the rule of law or the power of public opinion to sway the US government is just lying to yourself. We've never had more than a tiny measure of power in this system, mostly voting for one among a selection of politicians. But as you can see from history, starting whenever you want, voting does not make things better. It doesn't stop the people you hate from taking power. It just means if they can trick enough people, anyone can have power over you. If you feel compelled to vote because you'll either get this guy you don't really like or this guy you hate, then voting is a threat. Either vote the right way, ensuring corporate control of the world and mass murder continue unabated, or else a new era of fascism will be upon us. By the way, fascism is when white people have to go through what black and brown people go through the rest of the time.
Well, in that case, something must be done.
If you hope to preserve democracy by voting in people who will strengthen democratic institutions and checks and balances, well, who would do that? Why would someone want to limit their power like that, or limit the power of their campaign contributors? And that's why it never happens. How many years are you going to continue to watch hopefully while nothing useful gets done? How many times do you think I could punch a brick wall until I broke through it? Any number you say is wrong. The answer is I could never punch through a brick wall. It's built that way. I'm better off going around it and avoiding it altogether until I have the right tools. We can all think of policies, laws, and regulations we think should be implemented. There are policy suggestions in every book and thread under the solutions section. But who's going to implement these great ideas? This government? The next one? The answer is no. You might want to start asking why the answer is always no. Why in a self-styled democracy can the people never have what they want? Either democracy doesn't exist, as it's ruled by the state, ruled by the ruling class, ruled by a small group of people who hold all the power, or else we do live under a democracy, and this is the best it can do for us. All those promises to return power to the people or clean up the system so it works for the people now were empty. They had to be. Even if they were made sincerely, the system doesn't permit it. It can't just do anything. It's designed for passing and enforcing laws, making the rich richer, and crushing resistance. There's no way to turn that into a vehicle for the good of everyone. So why do we spend so much time on it? Even though we have basically no effect on it, we stay glued to the news for hours a day, listening to the same analysts spend hours and hours interpreting and reinterpreting the same events. Why do we spend so much time listening and arguing about people and parties when we have no say? Some tactics you may have been considering that will not save your democracy or make anything better: following the rules, taking the moral high ground, making fun of Trump, fact-checking Trump, arguing with right-wingers, pointing out right-wing hypocrisy, starting a new hashtag, replying to politicians on social media, putting someone in prison, blaming easy targets, supporting the same parties and policies and systems that got us here, and finally, starting a new political party. If you've lost faith in the Democratic Party, good. They never worked for you anyway. They were always just the lesser evil, right? After elections, many voters figure If we only started our own political party, we could get what we want. It wouldn't be one of those corrupt corporate parties. It would be a new kind of political party, one for the people. We wouldn't need to vote for evil anymore. I think people believe a new party could change things because they don't really understand what the state is. We've been brought up to think of it as this neutral entity that just does whatever the people want it to. So if it isn't doing that, it must be broken. The problem must be the wrong people in government. But you've got to go deeper than that. You've got to see these institutions as systems from a historical perspective, looking at what they actually do and why. What most of us do instead is look through the lens of vaguely defined words like democracy, human rights, and the greater good. I don't know everything, but I have spent more than 20 years studying this stuff, while most people have spent no time on it and fall back on what they were taught in high school. The media don't try to dispel these myths, but reinforce them, because their owners benefit from the same status quo. I don't blame people for thinking the one way they've been taught to think about something. I just want to give them the opportunity to think in different ways. If you look at what the state does, what it's always done, you see a clear pattern. The purpose of the state is to impose the decisions of the ruling class on everyone else and make it all look legitimate. Think about how it's designed. By its nature, it sets up a hierarchy over everyone. A few people at the top make the biggest decisions and force everyone to abide by them. Why would it be that way if the people were in charge? Hierarchies are set up so people at the top don't have to answer to the people on the bottom. Hence all the soldiers and police and security. People at the top of different institutions have an interest in working together for the many individual benefits to be gained from the patronage. But those benefits can only ever accrue to a small minority of the population because it's inevitably everyone else who pays for it. If you want to start your own party so you can be at the top and get the benefit, like the founder of a Ponzi scheme, go ahead. But don't start one under the illusion you can help everyone and make the world a better place. There's a reason the people in office don't make the world any better. They can't. Oh, sure, they can make tiny changes here and there after years of playing the game and voting for bills they don't believe in. But they don't have the power to make the real change that visionaries want. In fact, the state exists in large part to resist such changes. How would you make those changes? By working through the system. The system prevents change when we need it more urgently than ever. The incentives are all to work for the people who have all the money. And that's another major problem with entering electoral politics, the huge amount of money you need. Again, this is all by design. The people with power want to make it harder for others to contest it. So you can't just declare yourself a candidate. You need to register, which takes money, and work, which means staff. You need to get the word out, which means more staff, plus various costs like offices and websites. There are all kinds of legal hurdles, which means lawyers. Where does all the money come from? Either you get it from big business and rich people, which means, like all the other parties and politicians, you work for them now, or you get it from the community, which means instead of spending that money on things they need, they give it to you to do what you say you're hoping to do. Don't you think that money and that effort could be spent on something more productive? Like what? I hear you ask. Well, think about exactly what you want to achieve. Don't you want to help the community? Because you don't need to go to Washington to do that. Think about what it would take. Isn't there a cheaper and more direct way to get it? How many people do you need? How long will it take? Now you're a project manager. What if I told you, despite everything I've said today about the state, you can still have democracy? Existing so-called democracy is too hierarchical and has too many people. Why would it be necessary to make decisions in groups of millions of people? Why do decisions have to be made by a central committee and imposed on everyone? They don't. We can make decisions by consensus, together in groups of any number. I suggest under 100, but bigger is workable. Together you come up with a framework for making decisions, resolving disputes, and getting stuff done. No brick walls to punch through. There are groups like this in communities all over the world, some of which are legally registered and others that fly under the radar. There are a lot of resources on this topic, and I've talked about it before, so check out this video and the books and articles in its description. In the end, the attempt to save democracy isn't really different from the attempt to save our country or civilization. You're fighting someone else's fight for and against abstract notions. We shouldn't be trying to save this system, but creating horizontal systems based on mutual aid. You can have democracy, but you need to create it and maintain it. Like a garden. You've got to keep people with authoritarian mindsets from trampling it. Strong communities and organizations make the state and the market obsolete. It's taking your freedom back instead of asking for what you're allowed. If any of this makes sense to you, look for groups who are already getting stuff done near you, or start your own. That way you can work for yourself and your community rather than a system of oppression. And it's urgent. We better start today.